So, what's up, guys, and welcome back. So, in this section, we are going to start the data validation. And data validation is all about the schema, checking if our data has the correct values, if we are missing values from the data, we have the correct data types, and all that. So, this is just a quick step to check essentially, we are checking the data quality. Okay. So, as usual, we are going to start with the config. Under the config, remember we are creating a new stage. So this is something like a stage number 2, and for stage number 2 is about the data validation. So data validation. Again, under data validation, there are some things that we need to include. So something like as we did earlier, something like a root directory, where we are going to create something like or we are under the data validation, we are going to print something like a txt file that will tell us if our data is valid according to the specific methods or techniques that we choose to look into the data. So again, you're going to set up a root directory. Again, artifacts, data validation, that's okay. Then you're going to create a data directory. So that will be the data, no, supposed to be artifacts. So artifacts, a data ingestion. Then battery rule .csv. So essentially, we are saying that this path is essentially the path that contains the data itself. So that's the data directory. Data directory. So this contains the data that we are going to do the validation tests. So this one is about getting a folder that will store this file that we are going to create next, which is something like a status file. So this file, we can say, call it specify the path. So artifacts slash data validation slash status file, status.txt. So you can use txt, but in the next session we can for such files we'll specify to only use a JSON file. But let's use txt file so that we get to understand, so that when we just replace the txt file with a JSON file, there's no problem with that. So this is about the data validation. Then we go to now trial 2 data validation and start building that, the chaining those entities together. So again, we are going to start with the necessary libraries. The common ones that we have seen is the data class and the path. We also need to import again from src.rulebattery. We need to import the constants. So the constants we're going to import. So the constant we are just importing with the asterisk. Then again from again src rulebattery, we are going to import from the utils. Again, commons, we are going to import the read YAML. Waiting something you need to import. So that's the read YAML. We read the YAML file and also the create directories. And now we need to import import OS. Then import this one. Let me change this together. So from src.rulebattery, we are going to import the logger. We are going to import logging. So then import OS. And we can also import pandas are speedy. Those are the libraries and many others that we are missing. So the first thing is about the data validation entity. So let's get that data validation entity. So I had prepared that. So I think by now you understand where we are getting our entity. So data validation entity. We're just going to the config.file. We're just copying these files here. Then we are adding. Since we are querying the schema, we need to go to now to the schema.yml file, and we need to specify the column names as well as the column names. We just copy it first, then we can explain what we are dealing with there. So we are specifying the different columns. So these are the different columns that we do have in our data, and we are looking at the column and we are specifying the data type. So for the cycle index, the data type is int64. The discharge time is supposed to be a float, float, then the int64, and we're also specifying the target column. So our target column, as we saw in the previous analysis, the target column is the rule RUL, which is the remaining useful life. So that's our target column, and we are specifying this in the schema.yml file, so that when we read that file, we need to get that information. So I think the old schema, I think it is that. Then you can see the schema file. The schema is in form of a dictionary. So I think that's the thing that we are specifying with this old schema. So after that, we need to again go back. Then we have our data validation. So we need to set up our configuration manager. The configuration manager. So data validation manager. So I'm just going to copy the configuration manager and see what it does. So this is the configuration manager. This is what we saw earlier. Then we are reading this. So when we configuration manager, a class that manages the configuration by reading them from the different YAML files. So again, here we are specifying the different YAML files. So we have the read YAML file, the params, and the schema. We are specifying those. Then under the data validation config, we do have, so we can see where the old schema is coming from. So this is the schema. The schema, we are specifying the different columns. So old schema, we are going to read this from the old schema, and the schema comes from this one here, and this one here. The read the schema.file path schema comes. We are reading that file from the schema.yml. So from the schema.yml, we are going to access that file with this. We are going to read that YAML file with this read YAML from the schema file path. Then after that, we under the data validation config, we are creating an instance of that. Then when we are going to return that object, we need to ensure that we do have the schema here. So after that, we need to create a class for data validation. Let me just copy the entire code, and then we can just go step by step to explain whatever is happening. So if we are to write this line by line, then it might take a lot of time. So we are creating an instance or a class for data validation. This is analogous to what we did earlier. So that is the data ingestion. So the class is responsible for the actual data validation process. So this is the class for that. Then what it does, it connects. Earlier also that it connects the MongoDB and fetches the data. So this one just fetches the data. Then we start the actual process of validating the data. So I've created a method. The first method is the validate all column. So here we're trying to say that essentially what we are doing, we are trying to see that the data that we have ingested into the system contains all the columns. So validate all columns. So validate the validation status to be true if we have all the columns. So all the columns is we are listing all those columns. So the schema again for that. So missing columns, all for column in all schema. So if you're missing columns, if column not in all schema. So if we don't have columns in all, if you don't get a list of all columns, then we are going to be missing some columns. So we are going to we are getting a variable that will store the missing columns. So if you have extra columns again, we are getting a for loop to check for that. So if you're missing columns or we have extra columns, then the validation status should be false. Okay. Then we need to open the status file that we created. Then validation status, we are specifying if the missing columns, if we are missing some column, then we are going to write to that folder the columns that we are missing. So we already provided a list of the columns that we do expect. So if you are missing some columns, so it will note the columns that you're missing, then it will go to the status file and give a list of the columns that we are missing in our data. So if you have extra columns, again, it's going to, it will get the list of the columns that we do have, then compare if there is an extra column. If you have an extra column, again, it's going to open the status file and give the name or give a list of the columns that are considered as extra. So again, we return this. So that's all about how we validate if you have the whole number of columns. So we are also creating a new method, and this will validate the data type. So you can see, as you can see in the schema, schema.yaml, you can see that we do have the column name as well as the data type that we do expect for that column. So again, we are going to use this function to do that validation. So it's going to do the validation, all schema again. The type, if there's a type mismatch, then we are going to check for that. And if you have that mismatch, then the validation status will be false. Then if it is false, we are going to again write the data type validation status for that column, and then see validation status. Then it will write if there is a difference in the validation in the data type. Okay, so if type matches, then type matches, type mismatch, then that. So you can just for column expected type in all columns items, if column in data dot columns actual type. So essentially with this, we just after reading the schema.yaml, we are noting the column and the data type. So for this, we are trying to check for that mismatch, and if there is a mismatch, then it will raise that type of mismatch, and it will store in the data.txt, the status.txt file. Then after this, we can then just call the pipeline. So for the main pipeline, again, we are initializing the configuration manager, then get the data validation configuration object. Then we create a data validation object with the obtain configuration, data validation config, then the data validation config. Then fetch the CSV file from the MongoDB, or we specify the file path where you can find our file or the data itself. Then we perform the data validation for all columns. Again, this one. Then we perform the data type validation for the columns. Then if column validation status and the type validation status. So I think if they are not true, if they are true, then validation completed successfully. But if there is something like an error, it will erase the false. Then this is the message that we're going to print, and we are encapsulating this pipeline inside the try block, so that we are able to define the where we're getting that error from, and then so from there we can sort that error out. So this is all about the data validation. Other things that we can add is, for example, if we do have missing values, or if your data should be in a specific range, then you need to add those methods. So you can just list those methods from here. You list the method, tell the method what it's supposed to be doing with the relationship to your data. Then it will do the same. Then you can print such information. Then from there, you're able to validate your data. So I'm going to execute this. So I'm just going to copy the relative path. Then we can execute this validation pipeline. So we can say Python experiment validate. Then we need to create another folder that will be the data validation folder. So you're getting an error, no columns to pass from file. Created a directory. And, let's see. Config.yaml. We are getting an error. Let's see where the error is coming from. So data validation. So we are getting an error just because of I think one thing in the config.yaml. I think we did not specify the correct name of the collection name. Okay, that's why I think we are getting an error, because when you go to the document itself, let's say data ingestion, and open this in the file explorer, data ingestion, you can see that we have the file itself. But when we open the file, it's a CSV file. You can see that the file is empty. So the file is empty because I think we misspelled the word Betsy. It's supposed to be Betsy, RUL. So I think that will correct the error. So when you go back to our data validation, and now in our data validation, I think everything is now okay. So let's execute it again and see if you're going to get an output. So let's do that again. So data validation, and let's see. So the data was coming as an empty CSV file. So with an empty CSV file, it was very difficult for us to verify the columns, as well as, again, now we're getting the same error. So let me see. It's supposed to be Betsy rule. Then for the experiments, supposed to be Betsy rule, but for the experiments, let me correct something. So we need to go back to the config.yaml. This, so config.yaml. Artifacts roots. I think everything is now okay. So that's a simple error that we are facing. Then I need to delete the artifacts folder, so that we start this process afresh. So let's see if we are going to get, let's start with the data ingestion component. So copy relative path, Python experiment child. Okay, so we need to query the database, get the data, and it shouldn't be in an empty CSV file. So let's see if we are going to get shouldn't be an empty CSV file. So shouldn't be an empty CSV file. So I think this one is complete. Let's go to our artifacts folder and open the CSV file collection. Experiment artifacts ingestion. Yeah, I think now it's okay. You can see we are getting the data itself, not an empty file, not an empty file. So that's okay. Can just close this. So data is not an empty file. So I'm going to again do the data transform, data validation. So just copy relative path. Now Python experiment trial, that's okay. Python experiment trial, that's okay. So let's see if you're going to get if this is going to run successfully. We don't need to get that error because now our data, yeah, now everything is okay. So the error was all about the error was coming about in the collection name. We did not insert the correct database name, so it was querying the correct URI. We are using the correct one. The database name was the correct one, but for the collection name, it was not the correct. So that's why you're getting an empty data. You're getting an empty CSV file. So if you go back to our artifacts, you can see we have the data ingestion as well as the data validation. So from here, we have the status.txt file. Under the status.txt file, we have the validation status, which is true. That means we do have the correct columns in our data, and the validation type, data type validation status, again, it is true. So after checking that, you can see that we do have the correct data as well as the data type matched correctly. So that's why we are getting a true and true. So after this, so that was just a slight error on my side. That's why we are getting that a problem, that challenge. But once we have corrected that, you can see that everything is okay. Also remember, these things are very common when you are writing this code. Even a single comma, a single space that is not supposed to be there, a single full stop, a mistyped letter can cause a lot of problems. So you need to be very attentive, very careful with that. But those problems are common, so you need to encounter such problems while writing a code, so that it fortifies you and you learn how you can correct such errors when they arise. Okay, so you can just learn from the errors that you are getting. From here, I think we are empty data error, no columns to pass from file. So from there, you can now realize, why am I getting an empty data? Maybe I'm copying data from the wrong database, or I'm copying from the wrong collection name. Maybe I'm passing in the wrong URI. So those things come into play, but you need to encounter such problems, learn how to solve them, so that in the future you are just okay when you encounter such challenges. So that was it. So the next thing that I'm going to do, we are going to now convert our data validation into a modular coding. So we separate the entity, the configuration manager, and the pipeline into separate components. So we are going to start with the entity. So I'm going to go to the entity, config entity, then the data config entity, we need to the data validation. data validation. Yeah, tile 2 data validation, we need to copy the entity itself. Just copy this config entity, and I will paste this one here, data class. That's okay. Don't need to import the libraries afresh. So I'm just going to label this as the data validation entity. Data validation entity. So I think that is okay. So we are done with the entity. The next step is about the configuration manager. In the SRC folder, we have the configuration. So again, we go to our data validation. We just need, this one is this is already present. We don't need to repeat it again. So we can just copy this method up to here. So I'll just copy this, go to our configuration. Then we can see that maybe we can label this and say that this is the data ingestion config. This is the data ingestion configuration. Then now we can create another one. This one will be for the data ingestion, data validation config. I think that's okay. Then we need to of that, and just copy this first. Then we can change this and paste it here. Then we need to import the data validation config. It's just in the same entity, so I'll just introduce brackets so that we can import more than one module from the config entity. So this one will be the data validation config. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it here. So that's the data validation config. Anything that you are missing, I think everything is okay. That's the data config done. The next is about the components. So data validation component. Go back to my data validation config experiment. Then I'll just copy the class validation all the way before the pipeline. Then data validation component. Give some space for us to import the necessary libraries. Then we do need the data validation config. So from src rule battery dot entity dot configuration entity config entity, we're going to import data validation config. That's it. Data validation config. No, it's supposed to be data validation. Make sure the spelling is correct, otherwise you're going to encounter some challenges. Then we do need any other thing. We need logging. I don't think we do need logging. Pandas logging, I don't think so. Anything we are missing? Also, another thing, if you want to explain this one, for example, if you want to explain whatever is happening here, I'm using tab 9, which is something like a Git copilot. I'm able to explain whatever is happening here. So for example, the selected code snippet is part of the data validation class, which is responsible for validating a dataset. Which is responsible for validating a dataset against a specified schema. The validate all columns method is used to check for missing and extra columns in the dataset. So you can see that the method starts by initializing the variable validation status to be true. Then this variable will be used to track the overall validation status. So if we don't encounter anything, then this method will return to be true. So the method retrieves the list of columns from the dataset using the list.data column. So we are getting a list of the columns from here and a list of columns from the schema in here. Okay, then the two lists missing columns and extra columns are created to show the columns that are missing or extra in the dataset. So that's the reason as to why we are using this. Okay, then after that, the missing column list is populated by iterating over the schema. So we are doing that. I think this one here. So it's going to iterate over the schema columns and checking if each column is present in the dataset column. If a column is missing, it is added to the missing column as a list. Then from here, with this, if either the missing column or the extra column list is not empty, the validation status is set to be false, according to this one. Then we created that txt file. So that txt file, the method then opens the specified this file, txt file, status file. Then with the write mode, so this one here, we are going to write some information on that and write the validation status. So validation status, if it is true, that's why you are getting true, then it will give the list of the missing columns as we alluded earlier, and also the extra columns in the file. Then finally it returns the validation status. Okay, so you can explain whatever is happening here. I think the same thing is happening here. Again, you can just explain here. So with the tab 9, you are able to get an explanation of these different methods. Again, the selected method within the validation status validation class is responsible for validating the data type of all columns in the dataset. Again, we're just repeating the same thing. Takes a data parameter, which represents the dataset to be validated. And inside the method, we are creating a dictionary type mismatches. Dictionary type mismatches is initialized to store all the columns that have a data type mismatch. So we are this one here. We are creating this. The all schema attribute of the config object is accessed. So we are accessing that to retrieve the expected data types. So we listed a column as well as the data type. So we are doing that. Then we are creating a loop to iterate over each column. So this one here. So after the loop, a Boolean variable validation status is set to false if any type mismatch are found. Okay, so this one here. So if there is a mismatch, we are going to raise this. Otherwise, the validation status and any type of mismatches are written in the status file. So we are going to open that file and write whatever we are getting from this. The file is opened in append method to preserve the existing content. So remember, from this method we wrote something to that file. So to avoid removing whatever we had written earlier, so we just use the append to preserve the existing content. So if it is false, we are going to write false, and then I think we'll specify the column and the type of mismatch that we are getting. Okay, so that's it. So that's if you need a detailed explanation, so you can obtain it from the I've explained it, or if you can if you're using tab 9, then you can just click on the explain or document or ask, then you can get explanation. So that's it. So we were at the components, data validation. So I think we are done with the components. Then we move to the pipeline. Under the pipeline, the data validation pipeline. So pipeline, we are going to import again the necessary libraries. Again, from src.rulebetsy config configuration. We are going to import configuration manager. We're also going to import we are going also to import the components. So components, This one will be C2. Then you're going to import a data validation. That's it. That's okay. Then now you're going to import logging. So from src battery logging, and also pandas. So import pandas as ed. Then we specify the pipeline name. For pipeline name, you can say pipeline name. You can say a data validation pipeline. So data validation pipeline. Then you can say class data validation pipeline. So def underscore init underscore self. I think it's pass. Then we need to, that's okay. Then we need just go to our data validation, and you can just copy this. You can just copy this here. So just copy data validation, get in the pipeline. You can just paste this one here. So for this one, maybe don't need these comments. We provided these comments in the trial when you are testing if this will work, the pipeline will work. Then we can then do the if else. Then we can just do this main. That's okay. Instead of main, supposed to be run. Then terminated successfully. Maybe you can shorten this. This is the data validation pipeline. Are we missing anything? I don't think so. Data validation pipeline. This one is this one. Okay. So after this, we go to the main.py. So again, main.py. Then we go to component number 2, which is component number 2, data validation pipeline. We need to import it. So src full battery pipeline pip2 data validation, import data validation pipeline. Instead of main, it's supposed to run. So that's it. Then data validation pipeline, data ingestion, data validation. I think it's okay. Things okay at the moment. So are we missing anything? So I'm just going to clear unnecessary files. Data validation. This one is okay. Going to clear configuration. This one is okay. This one is okay. So this one is okay. So I'm going to execute again python main.py. Py. Okay, let's see. So data ingestion started. So let's see. Data ingestion started. So created the data ingestion folder. again, permission denied, I think. Let's delete the artifacts folder. So we can just delete the artifacts folder. Let's go to the config. My database, that is okay. Don't know what is happening. Let's either way, don't know why we are getting a problem with this again, but since we executed it and our prototype was okay, so what I'll just do, I'll just end the session at this point. Then I'll look into why we are getting that a problem. Then before we start our data transformation, I'm going to solve that problem. Then from there, we can just continue. So I think it's just an issue with the authentication, maybe a password, something like that, that is bringing this error. So let me check on that, correct that, and then I will just inform you of the necessary steps, solve that, and then I will come back to the next step. So before the data transformation, I will solve that. Okay, anyway, that's it for this session. So you can, from here, I think we have now seen how we can validate our data. And there are various ways that we can use to validate our data. So I'm facing some challenges with this, but I'll try to solve them. Then I'll explain to you what measures that I took to solve that problem. Once again, thank you for your time. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, like, and share. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.